I don't think it's only theater. I think it's the entire cultural project of different cultures that of different elements of culture that have been doing that have been creating that imaginary, precisely what you are talking about. I think the only solution that I can think about, and from my own position, is what I said at the very beginning: is who do you invite to imagine that future with? Because I think it is only through imagining a different future that we can have then reimagine the past and tell that past differently, tell that past in a way that acknowledges all those influences, that acknowledges the influences that African culture, Islamic cultures, like, shaped what we like so much about Europe and what we precious so much. And it's like it's the example of Pushkin that I use, who is partly Ethiopian. It's example of the blind poet, when Jan Lauer shows how the Arabic culture have shaped, well, in that production, have shaped Europeanness. So I think it's only by inviting people and like allowing and displacing ourselves from that, what you said, from those, and acknowledging that that's what it is, that's the only way we can move forward to it. And step by step, perhaps we can get somewhere where it is at least a little bit different and a little bit shifted.
Welcome everyone. Welcome to this session of forced migration in the arts. For today, we've got Kasia Lech and Claire French, who are going to be in conversation with each other around multilingual dramaturgies towards new European theatre, Kasia's latest book.
You asked me about the difference, and you asked me about methodology, and I guess part of the interviewing people and talking about their practices was also that anything that I thought I knew was every time was displaced and moved, and thing that I thought that's what it is about was not about. So I was in that permanently dialogue with different differences. But I wonder, because you also work on multilingualism and you work on the processes and you observe the processes, and I wonder how this is for you, how those different differences shift in you when you work as a theater maker, right? And you're very much part of the process, and when you are put as an observer of other processes and have access to like how those differences are different.
Yeah, so I mean, so as an observer and as a more active participant, I think I have very similar approaches, because I've been working in such ethically kind of unsure, kind of ill at ease settings, that my observation is participation. So I'll just kind of speak to that. So I think one thing that I've started doing is kind of, I mentioned before, this like soft language policy, which can obviously be reinforcing all sorts of different systems or knowledges. But because I know that when I walk into a rehearsal room, that I haven't been in before, even if it's been a while, I am really aware of making those policies, and kind of looking to co-create where possible, depending on how well I know them and how long I'm there for. So in South Africa, for example, a typical thing is to come in and say something like, please don't switch for me. And that is because people often switch between 4 or 6 languages in any given interaction, particularly in some of the performances I've been in Joburg. And it just kind of gives them the chance to have that breath where they're like, they don't feel like they need to care for me. They feel like they're more at ease with my lack of intelligibility. And then as a kind of a supporting agent for that, I've often had a camera or recording device, and I would be like, anything I don't understand, I can always have translated. And that's also really helped me because it gives this kind of longer temporal relationship to translation and understanding and all of this. So that's really helped. And then the reason I talk about that is because then that allows me to kind of sit in in those multiple identity factors and multiplicities, or web differences, where I can draw from other resources that will be not necessarily just in English. It might be calling on some words that I know. I'll usually kind of have a beginner understanding, at least, of many of the languages that I sit in the rehearsal room, and kind of have the affordance to observe. But it's also embodied, and this has been a big thing in South Africa, is that I've realized I have drawn from embodied resources much more, and kind of being more conscious of that in interaction, and also as kind of as a form of reciprocity, you know, in helping with warm-ups or in drawing on rhythm in certain sections of the rehearsal or performance. So yeah, I think that it kind of makes us all at ease, because sometimes the most difficult thing to get over is just people feeling like they need to translate for you, or feeling like there's kind of a duty of care there. And so then once that's out of the way, then there are kind of more opportunities for these multiplicities to emerge ultimately. Does that answer your question?
That is, and I wonder, because there are many people here that feature in the book, and I wonder if any of the artists that are here would like to, like, how does what Claire said also fits their processes, and how they work with, how they experience working with languages and observing others. I have not agreed that, so I'm putting people on the spot, so please also feel free to not.
Yeah, please put your hand up, or
Yes,
just jump in.
or just turn on microphone. I think I might have put people on the spot. Oh no, well,
No,
look, Pedro wants to say.
here.
Pedro.
Come in.
Pedro, whose line about accessibility means making things difficult to everyone.
Did I say that?
Yes, you did. Yeah, and I drill it on the into heads of all the students.
Okay, well, now it's in print. I can't deny it. I'm conscious that there are other members of the company, also of Sign Dance Collective International, here in this meeting. So I beg of them to correct me if I'm wrong. I'm speaking of somebody who has worked with the company for 14 years now, and I'm very aware of my position as an outsider in the main communication language of the company, which is British Sign Language, and but also very aware that, you know, so trying to pick up bits of sign every time I work with the company, every time in a project, and trying to sign. But I think in the work of the company, we try as much as possible to privilege the the minority language, the minoritized language, BSL. And so there is, to some extent, a breaking of linguistic hierarchies, but there's also almost like an affirmative action of the language that's saying, you know, this language will be made visible, and it will be hard for those who don't understand it. Because there is a matter of the wider societal context where the language is not as visible as it ought to be. And so within the performances, we try to make that very clear. So I think, and that puts me in this really interesting artistically position of the not knowing, of the not fully understanding, which is great as an artist, I think. But I'm sure others in the company will have different opinions, and also, as Kasia very well said, that's okay. That's the multivocality of the thing.
Do you want to speak to that, Kasia, at all?
No, I just echo everything that Pedro said. Like, I haven't been, so it's wonderful to hear that. And yeah, that's perhaps other voices can appear as, you know, I as we're discussing further and we're open to questions. So if any of it's so incredible to see the artists that feature in the book here today. I don't know if they want to turn on their cameras even. Maybe that's not, if that's okay. I see Vanya Hamidia Isaacson, I see Niklas Turenson, of course, Pedro de Sena. I see on the other screen, I saw Isolte, but I don't know if she's still here. I see Science Dance Group now, so and I saw Angelina as well. So there was it was really it's really thank you. Yes, Angelina Schwammerlin is here as well. Thank you so much for coming and for all your knowledge that you have contributed to the book. And I'm sorry if I'm not seeing someone because there are two screens and I'm trying to look who if I did not miss someone.
Just to point out in the chat, Angelina Lila said, she thanks that, and I believe Isolt is typing correctly. We use multiple sign languages, not only BSL, yes. and as we try, sometimes within the same sentence. So that's.
Maybe I can. I couldn't raise my hand. Hello, Kasia.
Hello, Vanya.
Hello, everybody. I don't really dare to speak out, but I don't know. I have a like maybe I can make it into a question to you, because I understand that there's a lot of people with a lot of experience here. So I am now trying to challenge myself and the group I'm working with I'm working currently in Finland, but with people from Sweden and Finland with various backgrounds. And we have no common language except from, we can all speak more or less English. But we are also, in our performance, we are going to challenge the dominance of English. So I told ourselves, myself and everybody, that, okay, so how can we do this working process without having only English in the room? Like when we are talking and discussion, when we are doing working on the stage, we use different languages, but while we are talking, we use only English. So I made a pathetic tryout to sometimes say that, I need to say this in Swedish, and could someone please help me to translate, or did you understand what I was saying? But it didn't really work out. It had to be done in another way. I realized it had to be more formalized or agreed upon or in the group. And does anyone here have any ideas or experiences around that? How can you work together, but not being dominated by English or another minority language? If I can throw in that question.
I'll start us off. I think that giving it a purpose that is historically seen as like less privileged might be a starting point. So, for example, if you ever swear, you might only swear in English. Obviously, that could reproduce other dominant ideologies, such as kind of pop culture and Americanisms and whatever. But I think giving it even another purpose that's like that you're very aware has a lower status might be a starting point for your devising. This is what I've experienced a lot and kind of worked with in various points in the UK and South Africa. But that's also a very kind of clear Anglophone tradition where you are kind of decolonizing and pushing against in a specific way. So it kind of attaches itself to more colonial and English conversations than globalized and English conversations.
Thank you.
During the Creative Europe project that finished last year, which was focused on multilingual theatre for young audiences, we imposed, and we imposed the rule that work better and worse at different stages, that you always start speaking in a creative room, because in the production room that was not working, but in a creative, in a rehearsals, in workshops, you start speaking first in the language you feel the strongest in that particular moment, and then those get translated and translated and translated until like that was taken from the book. Until everyone understood. And that was because English was dominating, and then there was French also present. So a lot of conversation was becoming bilingual between English and French, and was just translating into English and translating into French. And we were ourselves not aware of languages that are in the room and people that are speaking languages, because we were suddenly being divided into those that speak English and those that speak French. So the practice was to sort of start removing everyone from it, and that's the practice I use in the classroom. And that again, that works with different groups differently, and some students are more confident and less confident to do so, because that also takes that confidence. That I encourage them to bring their languages into classroom, but that's not your question. The question was the first one, sorry.
And maybe I can also ask, would it be, this is for you, Kasia, but it's also for other contributors and others who work in theater in Europe. What would you say about the tension that exists between the new European theater that you are proposing, and on the one hand, the historic role that theater has played in reinforcing, racist, exclusionary constructs, imaginaries of what it means, what Europe means, at the same time as we have this centuries-long history of erasure of African and Islamic influences and history in Europe. At the same time as we have a Europe that is constructing itself as white Christian and as being at war or being invaded by Africans and Islam.
I don't know what is the answer, like what is the solution in that sense, because I don't think I'm smart enough to know what is the solution to that. I don't think it's only theater. I think it's the entire cultural project of different cultures, that of different elements of cultures that have been doing that have been creating that imaginary, precisely what you are talking about. I think the only solution that I can think about, and from my own position, is what I said at the very beginning, is who do you invite to imagine that future with? Because I think it is only through imagining a different future that we can have then reimagine the past and tell that past differently, tell that past in a way that acknowledges all those influences, that acknowledges the influences that African culture, Islamic cultures, like, shaped what we like so much about Europe and what we precious so much. And it's like it's the example of Pushkin that I use, who is partly Ethiopian. It's example of the blind poet, when Jan Lauer shows how the Arabic culture have shaped, well, in that production have shaped Europeanness. So I think it's only by inviting people and like allowing and displacing ourselves from that, what you said, from those, and acknowledging that that's what it is, that's the only way we can move forward to it. And step by step, perhaps we can get somewhere where it is at least a little bit different and a little bit shifted. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it is about constantly displacing that precise imaginary that you have spoke about, but it is incredibly difficult because funding structures, which you need to create a theater, perpetuate that. During Creative Europe project, the two really difficult moments were legally difficult, arise from the so-called migration crisis, right? Because first of all, when the first mobility happened in Serbia, and the Tunisian partners were coming back to Tunisia. They had to change in Italy. They got stopped in Italy and sent back to Serbia because they didn't have a valid visa for Italy, and you know, there was the whole imaginary of who they may be and how might they be threatening. And then the other moment happened to Serbian partner, because when we started, Serbia and Tunisia did not need visa to each other. But as Europe was safeguarding its borders, the Serbian government was made to put a visa for Tunisians, in response to which Tunisia put the visas requirements to Serbia. We did not know about it. We found out when half a year after the Serbian mobility, or a little bit over half a year, the Serbian partners arrived in Tunisia and were stopped at the airport because they had no valid visa. So it's those things that make it so difficult, but that does not mean that we cannot be, that we in fact we must be trying and we must be challenging it. But there is a whole structural things and imaginary, and how people like imagine themselves and how people try to belong. And I don't know if that answers your question.
Because related to that, there's also, you know, the simultaneous absence of Black voices, Black bodies, Black thoughts, Black performances across Europe.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
And in particular, Black multilingual performances. That there are some, and there are some that were really important to development of multilingual practice. I'm thinking particularly about Teatro della Alba and the deceased now Mandaya Andia.
Yeah.
Because that idea of that Blackness somehow can be pan-European, and that Blackness can somehow have a other than colonial status in Europe is very new. The history of pan-European Blackness was written, well, the book, I mean, was written, what, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? And that's the first book that starts talking about it. It's like, it's layers. Like, it's incredibly well-built structure that we need to smash. But I don't know if the smashing works here or actually removing block after block after block until it. Like, I wish I had a more intelligent answer to it.
Thank you.
That was precise and intelligent, especially with your body. Since
my body normally speaks better than my mouth.
No. So we have one hand, and now I've lost it. Oh, it's gone back down. Does someone want to jump in that just had their hand up? Chitala? Maybe? Am I dubbing you in? There we go.
Yes.
Just jump in.
Thank you so much, Kasia. That was really wonderful, and Clara, for that wonderful conversation. And you talked about not understanding, not having access. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about misunderstanding, and if there are any liberatory possibilities of misunderstanding, especially at a time we do have to talk about understand, like the differences are large, and needing to come together is also high, intense. But how can we still, but misunderstanding is common within artistic, like within like political, social registers and spheres. But I was wondering if you could talk, based on your work with multilingual theater, what can misunderstanding do other than being a negative term? What is there something to excavate there about the liberatory possibilities of misunderstanding? Thank you.
I think from where I come in a book, and I use a term from Polish philosopher Wodziński, gościnność, which means both hospitality, but also the necessity to host another, but also as oneself being the other always. And it's sort of rooted in the idea that the only thing that we all have in common with each other, the only thing that we connects us is the fact that we're different, and therefore that by definition we do not understand each other and we misunderstand and we do have different perspective. So from that perspective, that particular perspective, misunderstanding is the reminder of that, is the reminder of the differences and the potential of bringing different ways of thinking, narrating, understanding into dialogue and conflict with each other. I think dialogue and conflict are sometimes synonyms, especially in creative process. So, because I guess I'm in the book, I'm more interested in the non-understanding than the misunderstanding, because if we open to the possibility that every single member of the audience has their own linguistic resources and therefore their own web through which they encounter the show and navigate the show, therefore misunderstanding cannot in a way happen, or happens as something that is the most natural thing in the world, and at the same time is the reminder that we are different. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And
There is
also, yeah,
there
I'm
is
just going to
something in the
read
chat.
from the
I
chat.
think it's
Yeah.
from Isolta. In
Yeah.
sign dance methodology, sign language is a creative tool that is fused into a choreography and functions as the core of the creative process. And good multilingualist scenario at the core of our creative process is when a multilingualistically diverse creative team of collaborators center on the physical and sign language as a mode for cross-cultural understanding. The sign language in this situation acts as a universal key to bridge a linguistic diversity. And that is, I guess, another answer to your question, a very beautiful one, Isolta. Jana has hand up, I think. Your microphone is off, Jana.
Thank you. Speaking of understanding and misunderstanding and miscommunication. Yeah, that was such a rich and really, really interesting session. Thank you both and the artist, who present, on the Zoom. I, of course, have a bit of a kind of bias, question here, right? Because I did dealt a little bit, with multilingualism a little earlier. And my question is a little more from the academic side, Kasia, and if I meant kind of, if I missed something, so my apologies. But I was wondering, so when I was doing the work on multilingualism about 10 years ago, so I found that there was a bit of a lack of theoretization, like from the performance studies perspective or even from linguistics, like, of course, everybody knows Marvin Carlson's book, on heteroglossy and so on, but I just think the question for you, like you've been in the field now, like not a bit more recently. So are there more studies, done? So are there more theoretical conceptualization, is done, around the subject, or is it still,
Well, apart from your work.
Yeah, like apart
Well,
from, like,
no,
I know
no,
it's
because
funny.
I speak about in the book what happens before, because obviously, like, this is not the first time this topic appears. And Marie Carlson is, of course, one of the key books that needs to be mentioned, but also your work with Katerina Penny, the modern drama, and the book, and then later on also the book with Palgrave, the stereotype book, which brought other aspects of multilingualism. That is one of the core books to is happening, but also Margarita Lera, here more in context of translation. and how languages then interact. Eva Karpinski, also in Canada, works that I have no access to, which I refer to the book as the ones I have no access to because they were written in other languages that I do not speak. And I was introduced to them through Vanya. Thank you so much, in Swedish. So there are several discussions that are happening, I think. So those works are there, and the question of hospitality, in hospitality as it is for you, the reciprocal hospitality, all those, they seem to be like a core, because how do you invite? How do you deal with it? So for me is that idea that in a sense there is no invitation because we're all different and then nobody's at home and everybody's at home. That I found the most suitable for the examples that I had and for theorizing what I understood from the social linguistic and linguistics about languages and from Derrida. Thank you to Magda Romańska to make me read it. So it's also those dialogues, right? It's and of course in Derrida on language as well. So there are other works, but you can only be in dialogue with them, and at the same time you always come from that another position. So for you, when the inhospitality was so important, how you do not invite actually, and how you fully embrace the not understanding, that is great idea. I was also really interested in how, and particularly because I was working within Europe with very strong monolingual traditions, how those that do not speak are also part of that, and how can something be in one language while at the same time be multilingual? Like, I use examples of Brian Frill work and Martyna Majok work as examples of something that is in one language but is at the same time multilingual. So and also I know Marysia Fragu, who I think is here also in Modern Drama in your journal, wrote about that multilingualism that is there but not there. So I think there are multiple theorization and that you are in dialogue with as well. So that's other dialogues that are also like the book is dialogue. It could have been titled In Dialogue.
And how do you feel the conversation changed, so from like, I think that a lot of things were in the past written from more like, like from my desk perspective kind of thing, right? So, and how does it, but you had so much interactions with the artist, right? And so I'm really curious.
Yeah,
how
so
the
I
dialogue...
didn't want it because for me it was really about being othered by language, and that doesn't only mean context of migration. It means all those moments when you are being put in a position. Oh yes, of course, Carla Johnson. That's true. I also talk about her. Thank you, Vanya. When you are being put in a position of so-called linguistic others, when your language is the other, the less, the removed from the dominant discourse, and that is not only migrants, that's also languages that arise from disabilities, that also languages that arise from minority languages, that also languages that are described as dialects, right? I have now in my class, and I know she doesn't mind me talking about it, a person who speaks Limburgish, which is a dialect, as she says, because it cannot be standardized, so it doesn't get to be a language. And she talks about how she is permanently displaced in Dutch language, which is her language, like it's the language in which she considers somehow as native. But at the same time, so many times she says something, and when she thinks it's in Dutch, she finds out this is not Dutch, but actually this is Limburgish. And I think there in that crossovers between all those, like this is a different way of thinking about otherness that doesn't grow out of a particular experience, but actually of multiple experience. Like in one of the production of Forat, I think that was in Smash Up, English is used as the language that actually does the displacing and performs that being vulnerable, being a refugee. And Swedish is the language in power, which of course it changes. So I think that's what was really important for me, to capture those intersections and to really look at the language regardless of what context and what experiences of marginalization it grows out of.
Thank you, Kasia.
Thank you, Viana.
Yeah, and just in addition to that, there are many like applied linguists that are moving into more artistic collaborations.
And Claire.
And
Also, Claire research on applied drama, like obviously, like I asked you that
Thank
question,
you.
but yeah, and Vanya, who did PhD on
Yeah.
like it's, sorry, it's yeah.
I think there has been an explosion in the past 10 years of people that are making those meeting points, and I do find voices in linguistic anthropology, so language ideologies, which Kasia calls on, are quite easily accessible, and there's also a lot of research in interactional sociolinguistics, and that's quite accessible as well, that is kind of moving away from a linguistic tradition and isn't kind of relying on a kind of close analysis of phonemes, for example. So yeah, I think I'm also positive, like Kasia, on the theory that's available and the new collaborations between performance makers and sociolinguists out there. That we can
I
continue.
can't answer. There is a question here about playwrights. I don't know about, is there much work on playwrights who themselves are multilingual and about the conflicting languages that exist in our own hearts when they write? I don't, like, there's a lot about playwrights in migration, but I think more about literature. So literature studies and that I think has advanced much further in this discussion. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I was going to put Jana's edited collection that you've got your chapter in on the bubble show in there as well. Does anyone else have questions while I do that?
Maybe Kasia, you could say something about about performance and languages as rights, and also about the tension that is there between state language policies and minorities and minority languages. Mm-hmm. And also, to me, it seems like theater actually has responsibilities, and what those responsibilities are.
I think, and I'm going to focus on example, I'm going to zone out on young audience for a second, because I think that is the most, when all those different things you're talking about come together in a very urgent way. So the performance, the languages, like language rights as human rights have been narrated, I think from 90s, both as positive rights, so being supported to speak language, as a negative, not being forbidden to speak language. And during the COVID pandemic, the Meta Lab at Harvard and Freie Berlin University produced this manifesto in which they talked about a performance as a human right, which for me speaks very much about the institutional support for seeing performance and for performing and encountering performance in broad and contributing to performances as being human rights. And in terms of young audiences and children audiences, there is of course Convention of Children Rights, which talks about the children right to encounter culture and to shape, have some agency over those encounters. And then I think about how many And children, of course, also like that's research about children audiences, how particularly vulnerable they are about images of themselves on stage, and how dangerous are those so-called childless practices of imagining children as full of imagination and creativity and what a child is without the dialogue with actual children, and how that shapes and sort of shifts how children themselves perceive themselves as agent. And then I think about young people, children growing up in multiple language contexts. So I don't mean only children that are migrant or second generation migrant. I mean children who are perceived as migrants because their accent does not fit, the standard form. For example, Nigerian children in England, the Nigerian accent will be perceived as the other. And children that are raised children that hearing children growing up in deaf families, or deaf children grow up in hearing families. So all those children for whom that linguistic context is not simple, and that is the majority of children. That research shows that it's a growing majority of children. And then when they go to theater, they see on stage only one of their languages. Maybe two if they are living in Belgium and there is perhaps French subtitles in a Flemish show. But they are getting a message that some of their identity is worth more than other, that some of their culture deserves to be on stage and some of their culture doesn't. That some of their languages are public and some of their languages are private. I remember when I was interviewing actors after Anne Berelovich workshops in France, young actress and one young actress who was Serbian. Well, she was second generation, but she could speak Serbian. She said what it meant for her that in those workshops she was made to use Serbian in public, language that she thought it was only for her and her mom to speak, that had no place outside of their home. I remember that. I remember my colleague who is a wonderful activist for Polish culture in the Netherlands, who told me how her son, who also is fluent Polish, when they went to go and pick a high school, said to her mom, "But let's speak Dutch, okay? Let's not speak Polish because they might not accept us here then." All those, theater has incredible, it's not only obligation, it has responsibility for not doing that. I also remember when we were watching, there is a Black Cat Theater in Amsterdam, who is a Dutch theater but Polish theater, because the male artist is Dutch, they are couple, and the female artist is Polish, and they perform the same shows in Poland and in Netherlands in 2 different languages. When we went there, and the show was in Dutch, but there was a prop and kids were shouting what this prop is, and my son shouted it in Polish, and the actress, who is Polish, turned at him, says, "Yeah, this is the newspaper, Gazeta." And I saw his eyes suddenly becoming half of his face because his language was recognized. And all this is more than responsibility. We have to. I was so glad that Vanya spoke about her work for children and her show. That was so incredible, the Yalada show, to be able to feature that, the work for young audiences. I also remember in Tunisia, when we spoke with audiences after the show, how one of the mom explained, and that was that was only accessible to me via translation between Arabic, French, and then to English, and that was based on translation. But she spoke about how differently because her son is blind, and she developed practice of audio description to his ear. But she explained how different that experience was for her in a beautiful way, because the show was multilingual. And he could hear, of course, that, but she needed to bring different physical or visual cues that made meanings for us. and how that developed a completely different practice. Something I would never thought about because I don't have access to that knowledge. So that for me is the most important thing. And of course, that is equally important for adults and everything. But if we're talking about imagining future and we're talking about new theater, then becomes about young people, young audiences, children. It becomes about not repeating stories like the story that Caroline Nguyen shared with me about how she did not realize until she went to Vietnam in 90s and with her uncle, and she realized her uncle's Vietnamese is no longer understood and he can no longer understand his language. How she only then understand that her mom tears on the couch was not something, oh mother, you're so sensitive, that this is political and that there is a value in it and that has to be on stage. And I also remember, and I hope Kenna is not here, but I hope he wouldn't mind, like that somehow terrifying thought. I remember being pregnant, I had as well, and we were talking with Kenna, who is Nigerian, and we were talking about our children who are in a very similar age, and he was saying how his youngest son, no matter how long he lives in England, no matter how beautifully English his accent is, will also always be perceived as othered, and that this otherness will never disappear. And understanding it 100%, I remember the terrifying thought that my son would grow up in England and his otherness would disappear and he would just be perceived as a white English boy. And that was equally terrifying. And that
Why?
is my contribution to that.
Why was that terrifying?
Because suddenly his different ways of knowing, his different ways of understanding, his complex identity would be removed and just interpreted through his whiteness. Alex Sierz talked about it. Alex Sierz, who is Polish. No, not many people knows this. He is Polish, but nobody ever talks about him as Polish scholar. He's British scholar. He spoke Polish and he went to school. And then he was shamed into speaking English and that cannot speak Polish anymore. So that's why it's that incredible loss of what you have. It's my Dutch teacher, one of my Dutch teachers, who I love, who was like my favorite, I think, I hope nobody else minds me, that spoke to me the most, who was second generation Chinese and who spoke 7 different languages, but none of them was Chinese. That's why it was terrifying. That suddenly that way of knowing, that is not powerful way of knowing, that is already marginalized, is already disappeared and swallowed by the dominating one.
And how do those tensions sit with how you felt during the Brexit referendum?
I was terrified when the Brexit referendum happened. I remember the moment exactly where and this is, I don't know if it was happening before and I did not notice, or whether it started happening. I cannot have the level of objectivity. I remember coming back from IFTR from Stockholm and sitting on the train and speaking Polish to my aunt, and for the very first time noticing looks that I was getting. And I don't know if it was the first time I was getting those looks, or it was, I remember incredible amount of lovely old ladies, like really nice, I'm sure coming from the best place, coming to me and asking me in Lidl, in Tesco, to not speak Polish to not speak this language to my son. So it's all those things, because you do not see Polish on stage in England, and it's not about Polish; it's about all those other less languages. So for me, Brexit referendum was the moment when I knew I cannot stay in England. Also because Polishness in that referendum had a very particular discourse attached to it.
So
Yes,
suggests that especially for people who are multilingual, that holding on to those languages is resistance, really.
Yeah, it is resistance. It is about multiple displacement and resistance. That's the story of multilingualism, I think, in Europe as well, because it is a resistance of not disappearing, but at the same time coming into a dialogue that does not just swallows you. It's that balance between resisting and sustaining, and on the other hand, being in dialogue and allowing a change. It is incredibly nuanced. That's why, like, when I spoke about Frisian before, or Irish language, that's another, and I'm sure Steve or Suzanne can talk more here from much more situated position than I can. It's those languages that on one hand are empowered by the policies, right? But on the other hand, told that they have no value in a dialogue. So it's all, and those that just don't have it's yeah. So like Frisian is very welcome in Frisian, supported there, but I am yet to see a Frisian, and maybe this is because I'm here very short time. I yet to see a Frisian performance or Frisian language on one of the main stages, and I don't think this is like Netherlands only. It's yeah.
Yeah. So maybe if you could recap this, what is in it for monolingual Europeans? I'm using that lightly.
So for those
Monolingual
speaking one
Europeans
language,
to join this resistance, especially as Europe is
it's about
constructed.
being in dialogue without needing to understand. Because I think if I can imagine, and I can imagine because my husband speaks one language, that the most terrifying thing when you speak one language is being in a position, especially when you're coming from a dominant language such as English, and others perhaps can speak, is that idea that you will not understand. So it is opening, like it's allowing yourself to access works not only despite not understanding, but actually through not understanding. And I think it is also the responsibility of imagining a world that maybe I am monolingual and I speak what language, but that is not what the world is, right? It's the same question why we read books in different languages, why we read books about people that are different than us, the stories that do not only reflect our own stories. It's being faced with different way of thinking, feeling, narrating, sounding, experiencing.
Can I just jump in with reading
Yes.
Sarah's comments in the sidebar here? They've suggested the experience of multiple identities can mean unbelonging in all realms rather than belonging in multiple communities. And then later said, I'm not sure this was the place for it, but thanks to Kasia and Claire for the company, but what a fascinating conversation. But mainly what I want to read, because I'm not narcissistic, I hope, it's also making me think of diasporic memory of physical gesture and dance, and how traditional dances are remembered, forgotten, transformed over time and space. Dance transmission in this way, in my mind, as analogous, I always say that wrong, to language transmission and protection. Thank you, Sarah. Please feel free to jump in with an elaboration if you'd like, but please also no pressure. That's beautiful.
I don't mean to overtake the conversation. I'm just finding it so fascinating, and my mind always, I go all over the place. But yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts about that, if it's not completely taking us in a different direction. But I wonder, we're speaking about language, we're speaking about words, we're speaking about signing, right? And just thinking of physical gesture and dance, and how, I study specifically diasporic dances from the African community. So, like how is a dance in, Martinique by one community still holding traces of a previous community's dance, that over time and space looked one way, but is remembered, preserved, survives differently. I think it's also interesting to think about that, and how what we put on stage in the diaspora, can in some way only be incomplete, or is it different entirely? So anyway, I'm just curious what you think about that, and how, when we live in multiple cultures, we also hold physical memory as well as the linguistic memory of our ancestors. So anyway, thanks so much. Everything is so fascinating to me as someone who experiences a lot of what you're talking about and studies
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think there is an answer from David Bauer from Sign Dance. What happens when the creative potentiality inherent in reaching a conceptual understanding within a multilingualistic team is delegated to an interpreter who has no vested commitment to artistic outcomes and only focus on the function of interpretation? Do we miss the experience of creative discovery and innovation that results from those discovery? Okay, so that's another question. Sorry, I thought it was David's answer to the question because of the dance. I think not being dance scholar, everything that you're saying very much resonates with me, and the stories I know of different dances and their links with cultures and languages. I'm thinking about Silesian, for example, culture and language, and how it was both manipulated as a propaganda machine and also at the same time is refused a status of independent culture and language. I'm also very aware that there are dance scholars here who could comment on that. I'm looking at you, Sergio, who could comment on that in much more nuance. One example that I can immediately think about is Janka Rudzka, who was a Polish dancer unknown in Poland until 2000, I think 12 or something like that. And only discovered by a Polish dance scholar when she went to Brazil, and Brazilian taxi driver said, "Oh yeah, Polish, like Janka Rudzka." And then Poland learned about this incredible choreographer who contributed so much to Brazilian dances. And I think about a project, because there is very little known about her biography, that was done between Brazilian and Polish dancers using traditional dances from different communities in Brazil and in Poland, trying to use dance to recreate her biography, because that was the only way it could have been traced. But those colleagues who are actually from Brazil perhaps can say more about it. But thank you so much, Sarah, for this question.
I just put I seem to be being called as a Brazilian person into this, although and I had put a different an answer, not from a Brazilian perspective, but was on the chat there about a book that deals with this interestingly, with from Bharatanatyam and American Sign Language, and I found a link to the book. But Brazil is an interesting thing because, you know, only recently we have been re-evaluating and bringing to the surface not only Brazilian Sign Language, but the various 300 so indigenous languages that still resist within Brazil and have been erased by colonial, you know, Portuguese. And so, but in terms of theater making, we are very much still a European country in many ways, historically, and are one of the most important, the person who sort of brought the idea of a director to Brazilian theater in the 1950s was again a Polish practitioner. So, and now his name completely escapes me. Zimbinski, yes. So it's
I have no idea who that is.
Yeah, I mean, he was the inventor of theater directing in Brazil, in a way, like who brought as we know it in the sort of European late 19th century, early 20th century tradition. So yeah, it's really interesting how all these various identities mix up.
Thank you.
I think Jana was suggesting that we have the room for another 10 minutes, and I think it's nice to be pulling this into a close, and Jana and Ambrose might want to also jump in and conclude this in a more formal way. Kasia, is there anything else that you wanted to bring together as a final moment?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to Jana and Ambrose for hosting it, and Claire, to you, for the three of you too, and also Steve and also Shetala, for like, and all the, like, I just say thank you. That's all I can say. That's my summary. Dziękuję.
Thank you. I think Steve has something to add.
Oh yeah, just to say that I think this has been very valuable conversation. And when I think Jana was talking about the change in theorization, it was fascinating that people started to come out with various theorists who have been writing about this in different ways. And I was thinking it would be very useful for us, for those who are particularly interested in the subject, try to develop a bibliography of theorists on the subject. So I don't know if that's conceivable, but I thought it would be valuable.
Thank you, Steve. This is fantastic segue, to what I wanted to say, So first of all, see, like we've been working for a long time with Steve together, so I think we're thinking quite alike, by this point. Anyway, so first of all, thank you, Ambrose, Kasia, Clarina. So such a rich dialogue, so great. We will have part 2 of this dialogue, not the dialogue, but of the session happening on December 13. So the group Performance and Migration will reunite on Zoom. So and we will be continuing, asking questions of multilingualism and the use of language and performance and migration and so on, So please, if you're not part of the group, but you would like to join, please write to me directly at ymirzen@uottawa.ca, and just, I will add you to the big listserv, that I have of different members, so, and yeah, so there are a couple, like the session has been almost put together for for December 13, but if people are interested, please let me know. I probably have 1 or 2 spots, still available, to share the ideas and so on. So in terms of the bibliography, I think it's a fascinating idea. It would be really so useful to do that. So I mentioned earlier, so that was there is a website, so the archive, which hasn't been launched and still hasn't been launched because of me being very, very busy with other stuff at the university. But there is a website, so that which is called the Archive of Theatre and Migration, that has literature, listed, both secondary and primary. And I think that it would be, there's already a section that has to do with language and linguistics. So I think that maybe we should really start thinking of how can we collectively add to that, to that particular resource and finally make it open and so on. So thank you. And just a little pitch. Yeah. So I see some, yeah. Could you please, I see Vanya, you want, I will try to copy this address from here, but I'm not sure if it can work. But once again, so I'll just send my address. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Ambrose, maybe you wanted to say something?
Yeah. So I think the only thing that I can say is thank you. Thank you, Claire, for facilitating the conversation, and also thank you, Kasia, for your presentation as well, and the conversation and your thoughts, and for the book. If you haven't got a copy, you need to make sure that you do. It's really, really fascinating on so many different levels, not only in how it sets out, where we are, the histories of how we got to where we are, but also the possibilities and the gaps that still exist. So this is really a beautiful book that I will be coming back to often. And also thank you to Jana and Mason and Shetala for co-organizing this session with Forced Migration in the Arts.
And thank you, Ambrose, for hosting as well on your excellent series.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us.